Hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. Welcome to Certara's first annual Strategic Evidence and Value Communication Symposium. We're very happy to have you all here, and we hope you enjoy the session. I'll now hand over to Leif Peterson, who is the president of software here at Certara, who will provide a brief introduction for us.
Thank you very much, Tom, and welcome everybody. We're looking forward to have you here in our Strategic Evidence and Value Communication Symposium today. And we hope that it will be a good interaction through our two panels and the overall conversation that we're going to have on this topic that is naturally very important for all of us that are here today. With that being said, let me just spend a couple of minutes on Certara and who we are and set the context for Certara. So first and foremost, we are a company that helped accelerate medicines to patients with an underlying services and software platform that supports our highly capable staff that are naturally powered by great people, science and technology. We dwell at that a lot, and we try to work at that a lot to make sure that we actually develop both software pieces, hire very talented individuals to provide these services. And as you can see written out here, we have had general success with all of you that has engaged in the use of our technologies over the course of the last many years with a high level of success rate. I think here in the session we have here today, this topic is very, very important. Being able to clearly articulate the opportunity that a certain treatment or drug has, being able to clearly articulate the value that it will bring to the patient, is evidently important, right? I think we all know the stories that more than 50% of the drugs in the market today, or that are being brought to market today, fail, are not capable of reaching their full potential, or doesn't really get anywhere, which is naturally not good for the human race in itself and not good for us as companies as well. So part of what we'll be debating is naturally how can we improve that and what can we do to really put our best foot forward in understanding what we have at hand, communicating it, and making sure that it drives the value that it should. As a company, we have created ourselves a global footprint. This global footprint helps us provide services to you, helps us provide and develop our software around the world. So we have the local insight, we are optimized locally, but we are capable of executing globally. That global footprint is also an imprint of all the people we have. All of the people, as you can see here, is an impressive amount of talent that helps us develop the software components that help us provide the unique services capabilities we have, and hopefully provide the capabilities for you to truly deliver the outcomes that you expect as well. We're very focused on using those in the fields that we're talking about here today and that I also briefly mentioned as well. If we look at it in general and you then say, well, what does Certara cover from software and how do we see our coverage be? We're very focused on software that are either modeling or simulation, which you see here is themed as biosimulation software. This is naturally very, very important in different aspects of the drug development lifecycle, whether it's in discovery to actually find and advance the right molecules, if it's in preclinical or clinical work to determine dosing or other things that needs to be done related to those works. But it's also all the regulatory work that happens around us to make sure that we actually pick that up. We help accelerate that to the end value point, which is typically your NDA submission, but all the other things that goes along that timeline. And then naturally, not last but least, but the topic we discussed today, which is in the entire area of evidence and value, and make sure that that work that normally starts very, very early in the drug development and carries through into the commercial phase is being optimized and driven. And for those technology components we provide, we naturally provide a set of world-class services that we think is very important to help you be successful at either the usage of the software, helping you build the solutions, or help drive those solutions in general as well. So that was a little bit about us, so you just know a little bit of the context of Certara. What I wanted to go now is just briefly introduce the agenda and then hand over so we can actually start the first one of the panels. So today it's in total a 2-hour session. We're almost through with the introduction here that I have. And then we'll jump into the first panel, which is naturally the preparation work and what needs to be done to be successful with those meetings. And then the second part of the conversation we're going to have today is putting the platform in place of these powerful communications tools and what they can do for you to make sure that we don't get a 50% or more failure rate, but it becomes significantly lower. So that's the context of the meeting today. Make sure to listen carefully, be here on board, submit your questions, engage in the conversation, and we naturally appreciate that you're all here. So I will hand over now to get started on the first panel. I will hand over the word to Sean Bates, who runs our commercial efforts here. Sean has spent a lifetime, his entire career in this space, and is a formidable individual that will help host our first panel. So with that, Sean, the word is yours.
Well, thank you, Leif. I just want to welcome the audience to our Symposium of Strategic Evidence and Value Communication, and to the first session, which is preparing for high-stakes meetings. Before we get into introductions of the panel, I just want to make a few housekeeping notes available to everyone. The session will be recorded and available to watch on demand. All registrants are muted, but please put your questions in the Q&A box, and the Q&A will take place at the end of the session. Questions that we don't get to will be followed up on and answered by the panel as well. And please complete the exit survey when you leave. So with our panel, we have Maximilian Vargas, Senior Director of U.S. Access Strategy and Account Management at Certara. We have Dr. Alex Solis, Senior Consultant at Certara. And we have Andre Carvalho, Co-founder and Data Specialist with MindBeat. And so we'll get to the question. Max, what are the payer demands from manufacturers when it comes to approvals and reimbursements? And what are some of those pain points that they have?
Great. So I'll just kind of start with, and this slide will be up for a while, everyone. So you don't have to struggle to read it in the next 30 seconds. We're just going to kind of use this as a frame to kind of talk about our discussion here on the tenets of value, creating that value, and then communicating and capturing that value. And it kind of goes from left to right, as you can see along the chevrons here from phase 1 through approval and launch. So I'll start on the left. Value identification. We kind of use this slide as a way for clients to understand what are some of the information that they need to know, and then communicate, and how does that help them communicate with their payer stakeholders. The first thing on the value identification side is really to understand in full detail, your particular disease area, your landscape, from the perspective of unmet needs, the clinical landscape, the competitive landscape, and then really try and divine a product. Obviously, you have something coming out of the R&D space. Divine a product that sort of meets and hits on those value drivers that the market needs. And this, in terms of this helps set up what are the major pillars or tenets of value that your product is going to want to hit on. So once you know those things, then we hopefully design products and trials to meet those needs. Then we're in sort of the value creation mode in the middle of this slide. Thoughtful clinical trials, which basically meet two objectives: registration, so health authority approval, as well as HTA and payer needs as well. And often those are similar, but slightly different objectives. So including things like quality of life endpoints and really understanding clinical outcomes to be able to show a payer, this is the value our product is bringing. And the reason this phase or this stage has to be very thoughtfully done is because this is the evidence package that you have to support your price substantiation at the time of launch. I mean, this is what you'll have. So you're kind of building that story here in this phase. And then we move further to the right where it's value demonstration / communication or value capture, really through thoughtful pricing and contracting. But here is where, you know, we're developing value propositions, doing message testing, understanding what the economic impact of the innovation is going to be, and then really effectively communicating that to the payer community. So on Sean's question, you know, what are the needs and what are the pain points? If I just kind of go back to the left here, when you have some data or even before you know the product is going forward in development, it's beneficial to help payers understand what the unmet needs are in the category, especially if we're talking rare disease. And even if we're talking a well-established, you know, highly competitive market, it may be that there are some unique underserved populations, things like that, that are very important to communicate to the payer community, such that they are primed to receive any advances that your clinical teams will bring in terms of clinical data. And then as we get closer to launch, once, you know, generally draft / final labeling is known, then we move into, you know, kind of just really explaining the baseline clinical data of the product. Importantly, more and more now, as categories are becoming more and more competitive with more similar products, head-to-head approaches from a clinical design are always encouraged, not always undertaken. But when they are quite powerful and quite well received from the payer perspective. Obviously a risk to the manufacturer, I get that. But understand that they will, if you don't have a head-to-head, they're gonna kind of make it up, right? They're gonna kind of do their own sort of indirect comparisons. So helping them, giving them evidence to support those comparisons is important in this just before launch stage. And then,
yeah, I was going to say too, helping them identify that high unmet need is pretty important as well as cost mitigation potentially as well. What do you think, Max?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, because look, they're thinking about, especially in a category with other options, they're thinking about current spend, and then how will that change up or down with the launch of a new innovation. And you know, ideally you can show it's a down or a savings to them. But even if it's not, you know, from maybe a pharmacy spend, perhaps there are, you know, other benefits that can be highlighted on, you know, on an economic basis, in a broader medical sense, depending on where the risk is. Maybe there's quality of life impacts, et cetera. So absolutely.
And payers like early dialogues in general. So, you know, I mean, with that being said, these dialogues, what makes them high stakes?
So well, you know, what makes them high stakes is that they often are, I mean, you sort of don't always have a consistent and open line of communication. It's kind of like maybe you get a meeting when they find something interesting that they want to, or you communicate to them that you have something interesting to tell them. And, you know, it may or may not happen, or it may happen in a different format of what you're thinking. So you need to be flexible there. Yeah, so I mean, just access to them is tough. They're quite busy people, and having you know, some operate on sort of a scheduled P&T committee, you know, a scheduled P&T committee. Others operate sort of on a therapeutic area based review thing. So understanding that is important. And also, you know, where your category sits in their overall hierarchy, right? So if you're in oncology, you know, that this is a good place to be. It's a front and center category, or one of the top 10s, you know, diabetes, cardiovascular, things like that. If it's sort of a lesser budget impact type of category, you know, the time that they're willing to spend and listen about some of these things is probably more limited.
Yeah, I mean, it could be one engagement in an entire year, and there might be tens to hundreds of millions of dollars online for that engagement. And that conversation, as limited as it might be, needs to be highly impactful. And so Alex, this kind of sets us up for the next question, which, you know, what should we be communicating, and how do we do that based on what Max was identifying from the payer needs in terms of real world evidence data, localized data, comparative effectiveness data?
Sure. So yeah, like Max really well explained, there is a whole lot of challenges in each of the phases. And when you get into preparing for the payer conversation, you really have to optimize that communication. So I'm going to use Max slide as an example. The real scenario would be great if you could have one slide like Max that has all the content and you can very eloquently present it. But the real case is that most of our clients, and one of the issues that we find is that they have, through this value creation and value illustration, multiple sources and multiple materials. So the first issue is, how do you leverage these materials together when there is uncertainty, like Max explained? You have a short conversation, a longer conversation, you don't know what questions might be asked and what they want to focus. So we've been advocating, we've been promoting that software as a service is one of the best solutions to tackle this process, because you can get an option of an integration of this materials. We can get an all-in-one solution. So this has been very helpful to our customers in some of the examples, because they can prepare and control a little bit that uncertainty. They can control the conversation. They can avoid unnecessary pauses through that conversation that might kill the momentum of the conversation. So software, we find it's a very, very good option. Now, that is not the only reason I think what our customers should leverage software solutions. I think software has added advantages and additional things. So using again Max's example, I think this slide is very well put, but there are a couple of layers that you could add with software. So for example, if you want to focus a conversation on value demonstration, there is some layers of interactivity that certain platforms might allow you to control and focus the attention of your audience, which might be very important, because some of the messages in this slide might be the ones that speak the loudest to justify the value of your product, right? To get the outcome you want, the contracting, the listing on the formularies. Another thing that software, which we promote, is very important, is you can customize and simulate on spot the particularly models, right? So you might get into cost effectiveness conversation, budget impact simulations, and you might have some default data from some institutions, some available data from countries, but you might also want to focus and nail and simulate how that looks in the scenario for a public or a private payer. So that scenario is very important to explain and to not waste that precious time that, as Max explained, is very, very valuable. And then this is an integrated solution in terms of like, it works great when you're engaging and preparing for that, but we've had also examples where clients were like, we cannot show this data, we cannot do this. And there are additional benefits on having this integration, because we have clients doing in-house training. So this is very, very helpful, because each person and each CAM, every person will have their own style, but having a sort of like version control where you have the right materials, the latest version, the latest model, and everybody has access to it and they can train themselves, it prepares them very well to engage with payers and stakeholders and makes the message very clear among all of them. Finally, I think the thing that's changing right now, and I would touch this, is the current situation we're living in, right? It's we're in strange times with the COVID, and a lot of the challenges that are inherent to a communication in person are increased, because now a lot of us are in digital engagements, right? So having a software solution right now, it's particularly valuable. The reason for that is when you're in person, there is an inherent attention, your presence. People need to look at you. Here, some of the audience might be experiencing this right now. You have messages popping up on your right, emails popping up on your left, and this is the customer that might be listening to you. So you need to really capture the attention. So if you don't have a well-built tool or a platform that allows you to do that in a digital engagement, it becomes a different level of challenge.
Yeah, and I was going to say, even in a digital engagement or even a face-to-face engagement, you know, a lot of the times we'll see clients, and I've experienced this personally, you know, in my previous career history, is you're in front of a payer and you've got how many documents pulled up. You know, it depends on how many therapeutic areas you're covering. You've got less than 30 to 45 minutes to make an impact. It might be the only meeting you have, whether that year or that quarter. You've got 2 Excel documents with calculations. You've got PowerPoint documents with screenshots of other things that you've got in there. And as you're trying to tailor this message, you might have 2 or 3 of those pulled up, and you might have 10 different PDFs pulled up with peer-reviewed data. So, you know, how I always found that, you know, extremely taxing when you're trying to really combine all of those different pieces into a succinct value message. You know, that takes a special skill set.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, exactly. You don't know the uncertainty, you don't know the curveballs that the client might ask you. And again, you might have this very beautiful slide, but if they go and ask you what's the source, you know, where are you getting this information? And then if you can leverage with one click and download the asset and continue the conversation, this allows you to empower basically your presenter and your sales force. And this is key to basically getting the outcome that you need.
Yeah, I think a good digital platform does that, right? It empowers that representative in front of the payer or that functional area of market access to really impact different payers, both nationally and regionally. You know, Andre, when you're looking at how you design and effectively try to develop these tools for payers, what are the things that you think are most important in considering the development of those kind of tools?
Yeah, Sean, yes. When you think about this value proposition and this value story Max just described, and you have also this platform that Alex also just described, which is perfect so you can build more interactive presentation. Even then you have to make a few assumptions to make a better deliver visually, because visually is also a way to communicate things, and this could improve a lot of your message. So there's a golden rule, many people know about it, but struggle to implement. That is to keep it simple. So you have all this data come from PDFs, a lot of graphics, a lot of studies, a lot of real-world evidence, a lot of Excel sheets, videos. You have an amount of things to support your message and your value story, and now you have to make choices. And it's really hard to do it, so because you know a lot of these things can make the difference for payers. So one thing we used to do it and used to work really well when engaging with these people is that they have time and attention really scarce. They don't have, especially high stakes, so they don't have a lot of time and attention to spend with you. So you have to give a perfect shot. You can miss it. So the thing we do is, for instance, you have a real-world evidence. We used to highlight the outcome and have a few 2 or 3 lines to support it, and then you can use this platform resources to keep as background all the data you need to show off if you need it. Because some payers will be more concerned about if they have academic or even medical background, they will get into the details of the study. Others will be more thinking about the cost of the change. So you have to know how to convey this message different for different payers. And so having this interaction and a platform capable of bringing on data according to the situation is really special. But the golden rule is make it simple, show what is important and what you want them to remember, and also make it pleasant, because well, payers see a lot of stuff in a day range. They see a lot of people, a lot of information, and we want our value story to stand out, right? So to do so, you have to be beautiful, you have to be memorable somehow. So you have to spend a little of time and design resources to make it work, to make your presentation beautiful and pleasant to look.
So Andre, you hit a couple of good points, and Alex and Max, I'd like you to weigh in on this a little bit. He talks about making it simple, and for the audience, I mean, why not just use a PowerPoint or an Excel spreadsheet then if it's simple, right? So, I mean, I agree with what he's saying, but I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on the definition of making it simple, so to speak, with all of this complex data that needs to still be communicated?
Alex, I'll just go first. I think it's great, keep it simple, but we also need to remember that simple cannot just mean static, because I'm a good consultant, right? Every answer I give starts with "it depends." So when we want to communicate something to our customers, we want to put it in their frame. We want to understand what their frame is, and then put it in a way that will resonate best with them. So, and that's different. It's just the simple fact of the matter. It's different for every customer. So simple is great, but we cannot leave it static. So the PowerPoint doesn't meet that need.
Yeah, so I think what Landry is really trying to say, right, is that you don't want to lose the story. No matter how much data you have that you want to showcase, all of that data may not be appropriate for that discussion, and it needs to be tailored. And I believe what he's really saying is make that story really stand out and be impactful, and then layer that data so that you can get to it. I mean, Alex, what are your thoughts on that? And I guess how does that compare to what's out there currently?
So I agree with completely what Andre is mentioning. For me, the simplicity of something allows you to convey something and leave that takeaway message for the payer. You really don't want to waste time or waste energy on things that are not relevant. You might have it for purpose of transparency. You want to have everything accessible, but you really want to nail down and want to tailor that conversation based on how the payer or how the audience is guiding you. So it's very, very important to have these interactive tools to allow you and to empower you to change in terms of the uncertainty that you might be facing in these communications.
Yeah. So, Max, in the U.S., market access is different than in Europe, right? There are similarities, but there are definitely nuances. What would you say are the biggest differences that you've encountered, and what are those barriers in communicating value to a multi-payer audience in the U.S.?
So obviously one of the biggest differences is the distribution, right? The distribution of the risk. Even with the government, the U.S. government being the largest payer in this country, when you add up all the different types of people that are covered through different mechanisms, even with the government as the single biggest payer, we still have distribution within there. And then, of course, in the commercial space, obviously it's a third-party system with many different risk holders. Granted, the recent consolidation has kind of, caused that to be a little bit more heavily weighted towards a few, but still we have a distributed system, and you don't have that in Europe. In the individual countries, usually it's some form of a single payer system, and they implement it. I like to think about it, implementing it in different ways in Europe. So the distribution of the risk in the U.S. creates an issue for communications because we have very distinct geographies in this country. We have very distinct practice patterns in this country, even relating back to the local medical schools that are in that area. They have shaped and changed practice and prescribing patterns over time. And so, and then that all kind of bubbles up to what the payer is seeing on a population view. So the challenge with communicating is really just understanding that you may have different stakeholders with different frames of reference from different areas of the country that are kind of, responding in different ways based on their population. Let's not forget, in the U.S., insurance is a state regulated thing, right? Department of Insurance. Every state has a Department of Insurance. And they have to all the payers have to there's a feedback and a communication and approval process and so forth. So there is this there just the geographic distribution, and then naturally the I guess the different spread of demographics really makes that tough, because I've often run into this, you present national data and they're like, great, but you know, I'm responsible for this state and this employer group, or this set of employer groups, and I can tell you very honestly that national number is way off from what I experienced locally. And we can be talking about anything, costs, cost of services, cost of drugs, utilization can be different, very different. So, again, I think it comes back to my point about allowing dynamic changes during a presentation are kind of critical, or at least being able to pivot the discussion where the customer needs it to go.
And so, Alex, what are the best practices about making those presentations dynamic and still in keeping with the value story itself?
So I think we've touched a couple of points in terms of those best practices, but Andrea mentioned the simplicity of it. One is the integration. Two is being able to customize it, being able to adapt, and also have an idea of what payer you're facing. Max, you've mentioned that there is an added complexity in the US based on private and public payers. It might be simpler. However, how you leverage that information in Europe is also very important, right? So you might have a single payer system. However, just to give a quick example, you might still want to tailor your real world evidence to CCGs in the UK, right? You might still want to see what benchmarks go around. So having adaptability is also something that it's very, very important, and that allows your sales force to have a clear message around.
So, with that being said as well, right, when you're looking at payer data and you're looking at localized data or their own personal payer data, what other factors do you guys think are important in the incorporation of those conversations when you're communicating value, like per se KOL input, peer-reviewed publications? I mean, what is it that payers really need to see beyond what they consider potentially bias information from the manufacturer?
Max, you want to take this one, or?
Yeah, I was just hitting the button. I think it comes back to something I said earlier on how, understanding their particular frame and what their current experience is within that. Let's take a particular therapeutic area, and then showing them how things are going to change. That's really what, how things are going to change from a cost perspective, from a treatment perspective, because remember, they do have a mandate, right? Their mandate is to provide, they provide insurance, right? Insurance against costs related to healthcare utilization. So they want to be making things available, services, drugs, et cetera, diagnostics. They want to be making things available that are beneficial to their membership, because that will ultimately, they'll ultimately win in the end on enrollments. So it's really understanding what frame they're coming from, and then showing them how your innovation is going to change something. Either, like I said, cost, practice pattern, new, patient outcomes. Let's not forget that, because at the end of the day, that's kind of their mandate.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you're talking about outcome-based schemes or evidence-based schemes, that are particularly important, I think, probably in the rare disease space. And I know that you've done quite a bit of work in cell gene therapy as well.
Right, and there it's there's often a lot more time spent on the unmet need. These are, as of right now, a lot of the cell and gene therapies are for pretty rare diseases, and just rare disease in general, even if it's not a cell and gene therapy. Got to spend a lot more time on the unmet need. Oftentimes the clinical data is a little bit less robust, just given the nature of the area. But you often see regulatory approvals on and labeling on surrogate biomarkers, and that is, that to me represents a key communication opportunity for manufacturers, because they can then translate, well, okay, so our label is, to increase such and such an enzyme, or depress such and such something. But what does that mean to the patient? Show me what that means to a clinical outcome. What does that mean to their caregiver? What does that mean to their growth? What does that mean to their physicians even? Maybe they have to follow them a little less heavily, et cetera. Just, kind of going that next step, especially when you have that paucity of data issue in a rare disease, can be really well served with a quite a thoughtful and efficient communication program.
Yeah, and I would think though, and as well, right, that's where these registries come in, and real world evidence, patient arms even prior to launch, maybe utilized as well, where that data is so critical and so important to have conversations with early on prior to launch with the payers themselves, so that they can understand, one, how this meets the unmet need, but also, like you're talking about, also, what's the cost burden going to be?
Yeah, often they have no idea on the burden of disease, because they maybe see one or two, a handful of these patients in a particular geography, often clustered around a center of excellence, just based on, referral patterns and so forth. But yeah, I mean, that they need to understand the burdens from a clinical perspective on their provider network. They need to understand the burdens on the patients, on their caregivers from a clinical and quality of life perspective, as well as the cost, because often, there's no, think about it, they have no, what would a payer do with a detailed cost analysis of one or two patients, right, to follow them in a particular geography or in a particular plan type. But that kind of information is absolutely critical to support the value of an innovation that our clients are bringing.
So Alex and Andre, when you're creating that value message and you're incorporating this data, what are some of the best practices that you guys bring to bear on this digital platform?
Sure. I'll go first, Andre.
Okay.
So I think one of the best practices is, and this is taking the example of Max of rare diseases, is like how you convey that message, right? If you want to convey that message in a way that resounds, for example, if you have two patients in your whole population, you want to make sure that cost the message that it's conveying is that it's worth it in a way, and it's not going to be impactful potentially on the overall budget. So how you convey that message is going to grant you the access to it. So when we're building these digital tools, we want to understand first what is the therapeutic area, and obviously the type, in this case, rare diseases, oncology, whatever that is, have their own challenges and advantages. There's some that they might focus more on what's the unmet need. They might focus on the budget part, but we want to know and we want to enhance based on that therapeutic line, based on the market that they're engaging. We want to basically maximize that by conveying the message on the right way. Andre?
Yeah, I 100% agree. Here in Brazil, a lot of payers know little about patient's journey when it comes about diseases. They have a few amount of lives to know about it. Sometimes they don't track properly these patients inside the institution, so they know very little about it. And sometimes the industry itself actually invest in this kind of researches and deliver for them this information, more accurate information about the burdens of disease and all the stuff you guys just said. I would add also that sometimes you have to do a homework of have a few presets that is directed, customized for this kind of the profile of this payer. In Brazil, we have roughly 5 or 6 different business models of institution in which these payers are included. And sometimes you have difference that are not only regional. Sometimes you have an institution that have a lot of, I don't know, a young population or an older population, and this impacts directly in the eligible population, the calculation of this population. So this, if you have these presets considering these different realities, you kind of communicate, you thought about it, you care about them, and you care about what the struggles this particular pair have. Because one thing I think we are talking again and again, and it's a major issue nowadays, is that each payers have a different story, a different problem, and we want to be able to connect to them. And one last thing, it is that you could have in this a platform like that, you could have a process of feedback, and you in order to catch a little of this their reality, so you can have more and more customized experiences.
No, I like that a lot. So what we're going to do is for the audience, we're going to move to a couple of questions that have been asked and try to answer those. And then we're going to sum everything up with some wisdom from the panel on what they believe the audience should walk away with. So a couple of questions. One question is, you know, when you're communicating that value, what are your typical barriers that you're running into with payers that really kind of stop the deal?
So the one thing I'm noticing is the just sort of the when we get to a pricing discussion, more of the kind of a misunderstanding of the competitive landscape. Not a misunderstanding, but just sort of a downplaying. You know, like, oh, you know, that, don't worry about that competitor. But the pair is like, well, you know, it's coming, you know. So we kind of need to talk about that. And I know, like, sales 101, like, you don't mention your competitor's name ever, et cetera. But you still need to understand, again, it goes back to showing them how things are going to change. You need to tell, this is particularly for like an in-market product, say you have a competitor coming, and if you just, you know, if you're just kind of ignoring it from the perspective of the payer, you know, they don't have to be upfront with you about what the discussions that they're having with the other firm. And, you know, I think it's really good to just at least show them from a pipeline perspective that you as the manufacturer understand what's coming, and kind of start to build a story around how to differentiate now, because it's really, it's a changing market. Once that competitor launches, assume it's a new market. So what are now go back to that first part of, you know, the slide I was talking about. What are the tenets of value now that this new competitor is here? And just understand that the story needs to change.
And yeah, if you can, you need to start preparing that earlier, before the launch of the competitor.
Absolutely.
Not after the launch of the competitor.
Absolutely. And I continually see manufacturers who kind of miss the importance of doing that, or they, you know, oh, we've done it, but sort of watered down a bit, you know, and that can hurt, because then the payer will have had a full briefing on the clinical aspects and the clinical value of the competitor, and not really understand how our client's product can now kind of compete in this new market. So then it goes right to an economic and pricing discussion, which is where you want to go there, but you want to go there with a firm and solid clinical differentiation story.
Yeah. So we got one more question we're going to take before we give our pearls of wisdom here. We got a question from the audience. What are some of the top advantages of base case in comparison with a well-made interactive PowerPoint?
So I think I'll take this one. Yeah. So there are a couple of advantages that I see I mean, specifically on our platform base case. First of all, there is the interactivity part, the integration, and PowerPoints are great tools to show information. Don't get me wrong. However, they're excessively hard to maintain when you have a big sales force, for example. The other part that I think is very, very important is this platform allows you to have a very quick buildup of apps, which can be easily distributed and easily adapted through markets. So what does that mean? You don't need a lot of technical knowledge to build apps with our platform, if that's the question. So if you have exposure to Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, you can start building apps pretty quickly. The other thing that I think is very, very important is taking a PowerPoint into the last version, sharing it, and control, and having this version control. It's kind of hard. So if you have a platform that can basically within 13 weeks have an idea and an app on the field, this becomes a very powerful tool that you can basically distribute along all your users. So there are more advantages, such as the integration with calculators, such as the integration with data sets and integrations with other types of information that you might use, surveys, emails, that PowerPoint cannot do or do not very well. So
I think
there are advantages
to really pull complex data and modeling into the interface, right? And being able to interact with that interface very, very easily, in my opinion, is a huge benefit that PowerPoint really doesn't provide, as well as all the others that you were talking about, Alex.
Correct. Yeah. And then there's also both way communication, right? Like PowerPoint allows you to communicate, but with a software platform, you can also be getting analytics and be getting information and seeing where you're playing around, and that eventually is going to power more conversations or other teams in another market. So yeah,
and I think that's extremely powerful when you're talking about things like what we have is called Portal, where payers can actually access your applications remotely and engage with them, and you're able to track that engagement in terms of analytics.
Exactly.
And that information back to you, even without a face-to-face or virtual direct engagement with that payer. So we're running out of time. We got a few more questions that were to be answered, but what we'll do is for the audience sake and for time, we are going to answer those offline and follow up with the folks that left those questions and get those answers from the panel as well. So with that being said, I'd like to close it out. We got about 7 minutes left. If we could go with Max, Alex, and or actually go with Andre, Alex, and Max, and give your final thoughts as to what the audience should leave with from this session.
All right, Sean. Well, first of all, I think we have to consider payers is in a struggle to get time and attention, and we should use this the best we could. And this would be make presentations which can be simple, but also can deliver all the valuable story you just build, and try to convey this in a more customizable way. You have to customize it. You have to make it kind of personal so you can reach hearts and minds of payers as well.
Outstanding.
Yeah. I mean, the key takeaway that I would like the audience to take is that there is always a challenge to prepare for the uncertainty of engaging with payers, and that one way of doing it, and one way that it's very effectively, is leveraging software as services, software as solutions for all the challenge that you have. One is to engage the payer, but there might be advantages on it. So I would recommend, and this is a key takeaway, to look into your organizations and see what type of software services subscriptions you might already have, and if you don't, look into how you can optimize that communication by the options that are there.
Max?
Yeah, and just I would say that, kind of back to one of my earlier points, it really understanding and establishing what the value drivers are early is critical, because that's going to set up all of the messaging components, as well as offer some thoughts on how to present that, which is what we've been talking about today. But I guess the last thing I'll leave the audience with is that those tenets of value, don't consider them static. As the market changes, as your market changes, even if it's just your, you kind of own the market, practice patterns are going to change. You're going to get new clinical data, new real world evidence, things like that. And it's almost like you kind of have to always be updating and refining what does the market consider the key tenets of value here, and then make sure that you're communicating and messaging on those points as the brand life cycle goes on.
Thank you, Max. So I just want to thank the panel, Alex, Max, and Andre. Thank you for your time. And I want to thank the audience for tuning in and for your questions and engagement. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Tom now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you all had a great break. Session 2 will now begin, and I'd like to hand over to Roman Casciano, who is a Senior Vice President and General Manager here at Certara.
Great. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Tom, thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Roman Casciano. I'm currently the General Manager of Certara's Evidence and Access Business Unit, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel since basically quantifying value and developing the right strategies and insights for our external stakeholders is basically central to the day-to-day work that we're doing. So thanks to the first panel for a very lively discussion. I was particularly sympathetic to the challenge that they were discussing about how best to anticipate questions or objections really from payers and make sure you set yourself up to have the needed information at your fingertips and address those issues that are raised on the fly. It's clearly an art as much as a science to do that, and requires a lot of forethought, but also the right technology. And you know, forethought alone or technology alone can't address that problem, you know, alone. You can have the best platform without the right answers, or the right answers but not the right medium, and you won't be successful if you don't address both. So we're going to try and pick up on that theme and related themes, but also we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the challenges we face with value demonstration and value communication when it's based on real world data. So we'll do a little deeper dive into that aspect of the conversation. To preface our discussion a little bit, I think that our panelists will all agree with this, and it's been true for quite some time now. A successful development program and regulatory approval doesn't guarantee us the access we want, the price we want, and even maintenance of access. So more than ever now, there has to be some level of, let's call it, consistency between what the cost is of a technology and what's the perceived value on the outside, and that concept of value needs to be explicit, not just demonstrated in a trial 5 years ago in a very artificial construct, but demonstrated objectively with high quality evidence, and more often than not these days, real world evidence. And that just goes to the payer's recognition that they are interested in how a new technology is helping them solve their public health management problem in their organization, country, health insurance plan, and so on. So another thing I'll say is that the term real world data or real world evidence is everywhere these days, right? And I think there are lots of different perceptions of actually what it is, and people differ on where it should be used, how it should be used, etc. But there seems like some attitude with respect to real world data. Well, I don't know exactly what I want to get from this, but I definitely know I want some of it. And you sort of have a lot of organizations going in blind saying, oh, I need to do this real world evidence study, without really that thought about what we're going to do with it at the end of the day. What are the core messages it can support, cannot support, et cetera, et cetera. And I consider that our job as researchers to connect those dots. All right, with that said, we have a great panel today, this afternoon, to follow up on our earlier panel. And I consider the colleagues we've assembled here to be experts at doing what I just described. That is, connecting the dots between what data do we have, what can we do with it, and then what outputs come out of it, and where we are going to communicate that, how we're going to get that information to them. So we're joined by Oliver Latham, who heads EU Value and Access for Certara, Dr. Kishan Vyas, who's an Associate Medical Director and Medical Lead for the UK and Ireland at GW Pharma, and Dr. Sumit Bakshi, the head of Real World Data Solutions here at Certara. So we'll try to keep this interactive, so please ask questions along the way. They'll come to me, and I'll try to pepper them in to the discussion, and if we don't get them to to them in the beginning or during the discussion. We'll try to touch on them while we do a Q&A at the end and in follow-up as well if we have more to go. So we're going to kick it off with Oliver, and Oliver is going to discuss the importance of early and robust value communication that targets the key concerns and uncertainties that health authorities and payers worry about. Of course, they have uncertainties after a trial program has been completed, and more as of late. Oliver currently heads up our EU Value and Access team, as I mentioned, and he's previously served as the head of market access for Astellas Pharma. Oliver has specific experience in developing early access solutions and innovative contracting solutions for new medicines and rare diseases where evidence, especially of the real-world variety, is often scarce. So, Oliver, I hand it over.
Thank you, Roman. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about, as Roman said, how we accelerate access using a combination of real-world evidence, and also by engaging effectively and communicating effectively the product value early enough to payers to drive market access. As well as this, I'm going to give a few examples of what good communication and success looks like, as well as what some of the failures have looked like. So manufacturers are really possibly a little bit guilty of following long established processes to achieve market access, and are not necessarily set up to think outside the box with respect to how we communicate with payers. It's a little bit like qualifying for the race in the Olympics and not quite being ready to running it. Engaging early really allows us to understand payers' perceptions a little bit better and to help deal with some of the uncertainties, as well as how to address them. And then how to communicate how we will disrupt the current treatment paradigm, a little bit like Max said earlier, in a way that's going to actually help shape the health system and also enhance affordability or cost effectiveness. Please skip on a slide. Some of the uncertainties payers have around rare diseases and advanced therapy medicine products, especially as we have more and more of these being launched these days, are the lack of comparative effectiveness and the reliance on things like surrogate endpoints. And these make it easy for payers to push back and say no. It's our job to think of the payer a bit like our finance director in our business. It's their job to protect their budgets and to manage their budgets, and it's our job to help convince them of the value of this investment. Step one is to have a good idea of the predicted value of a product in the market post-launch, to be able to extrapolate early clinical data into meaningful real-world information, but also to be able to predict ahead what that looks like from an economic perspective, both in terms of budget impact and cost effectiveness. Step two is how will this predicted or assumed value resonate with payers? And step three really is what commitments do a company need to make to back up these claims in market? In other words, what real world evidence needs to be collected in the real world? Similarly to companies not being ready to, sorry, go back one slide, thank you. Similarly to companies not being able to sometimes navigate the system, it's, the health systems themselves are not in a position to manage new products in rare diseases, to be able to assess value at launch or to pay for high cost therapies. Some key payer questions include, how do you pay for a therapy such as a CAR-T when there's no long-term benefit demonstrated at launch? How do we deal with high cost curative therapies that may have a big budget impact in year one, but then less budget impact with years to come, particularly when the health systems only have annual budgets to fall back on? So what can we do to help payers make some of these decisions and help them deal with some of the uncertainties? And what happens if we don't? Next slide, please. So let's give a couple of real world examples. One way is to learn from past experiences, good and bad. Glybera, I think, is one that a lot of people may have heard of. It was EMA approved in 2012 for an ultra orphan disease, lipoprotein lipase deficiency. But 4 years later, only one patient was reimbursed and tried on the product in the real world. Eventually, the product was pulled from the market. The feedback from payers was that the value was not understood, communicated, or accepted by the payer community. And with so few patients on the product, both in the clinical trials and in the real world, only one, there were no clear benefits shown from the clinical data. Repatha is another example here, and I won't go through all of these. They assumed their value based on a surrogate endpoint, the reduction in cholesterol LDL-C levels, but it wasn't market tested. The Health Technology Agency said yes, but the payer said, so what? What does this actually mean to us? What's it going to mean in terms of reduced cardiovascular events, MIs, and strokes? So the company went back, they spoke to payers, they used retrospective data collection, and they made a commitment to collect the data that would improve cardiovascular outcomes and improve the cost of care to these patients. And this eventually drove successful access. But they did lose significant time in market. Can we move on one slide, please? So could these products have been more successful or achieved earlier access with a clearer understanding of the market and a good collaboration with key decision makers pre-launch? Let's consider what successful engagement and communication looks like. These are the first CAR-T therapy launches in the UK for Kymriah from Novartis and Yescarta from Gilead. Both companies engaged early with payers and understood that there was considerable uncertainty around the high price of the product that they were looking for, and also in terms of long-term data. They had to engage with multiple agencies, NICE, NHS England, and the Cancer Drug Fund. Through these discussions and negotiations, they were able to agree a price premium based on a commitment to real-world data collection, and then a review of this data and a review of the reimbursement in 2023. Next slide, please. Another example is Zola in France, and I think this is an excellent example of effective engagement with national bodies, but also what we can achieve together. To address uncertainties at the time of launch, Novartis developed a predictive cost-effectiveness model that showed a very likely and significant reduction in the number of hospitalizations for patients with acute asthma. The agreement involved a jointly created real-world evidence study between the company and the health authorities. The study was able to validate the predictions made by the product, and it led to considerable access and reimbursement. Next one, please. So all of these things really demonstrate how early value development, good communication, but also a commitment to collecting data can help with the demonstration of product value to access the time to market, the true value of a product in market, the level of patient access, and the potential return on investment. It also allowed companies to align commercial strategy with the market demands, to gain vital information on a product's real-world value and potential price, and often to accelerate time to access and the overall market uptake. Ultimately, we want to build and predict value effectively. We want to communicate this value early, and we want to back our product's performance with the use of real-world evidence in the real world. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. Just one quick, actually two questions. Firstly, when you talked a little bit about these sort of risk-sharing deals, and maybe you could briefly touch on the role of real-world evidence. Because it ultimately is real-world data that you make these deals based on. But talk about the preparatory work to get yourself ready to enter into these kinds of real-world based risk-sharing agreements, and how you use that to communicate with your teams or even with your ultimate payer to design the programs.
Yeah, sure. And it's a slightly different process depending on where you go in the world. But I think the overall philosophy is very similar. It's about understanding what's worked well in the market before and what's likely to resonate with payers, being able to build some of these early hypotheses, understanding where the gaps are in your current data set and your current value story and how you're going to address those. And then I think having a protocol ready at launch. So for example, the GBA right now in Germany are saying, for rare diseases, it's mandatory that you have a real world evidence protocol ready at launch, and we will reassess you over a period of time to demonstrate your product's effectiveness. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. You know, companies want to get access early, they want to get high value for their product, and we should be a little bit ready to put our money where our mouth is. But I think also we're too traditional in our ways, and we're a little bit risk adverse. So we sometimes don't want to do these things because we think that we're gonna come off second best. But I think, you know, being able to sit around the table and have these conversations, both with regulatory bodies and payers early on, can help prepare the market for what's coming, and it can help us understand where the opportunities really are to drive these access programs. And it might mean a big difference. Instead of coming in, for example, with a huge discount, you might be able to come in with a deal based on real world data collection that allows you to gain and maintain a price premium.
Right. And more of a sort of overarching kind of question. If there was one critical element in your value communication around real world evidence that would have the strongest influence on access, what would that be in your perception?
I don't know if it's one element, but I think it's certainly the, if we're thinking about the key drivers, it's things which are economically quantifiable. So for example, with Zola, reduction in hospitalizations, one of the biggest costs, of course. So it's being able to quantify that data somehow to payers and to build it into a model. It's great to have quality of life data, but sometimes these are softer outcomes, and it's hard to measure these economically. So payers really want to know things that can be measured, things that can be modeled, and things that we can back, because we then are able to also collect the data. We have to sometimes do, and I'm sure Samit will talk about this a little bit in a minute, but we sometimes have to be aware of what data is available to collect. We don't want to overpromise and underdeliver.
Yeah, terrific. Great, thank you, Oliver. Kish, please pick up on his thoughts if you like, but let me give a quick introduction to Kishan. So Dr. Kishan Vyas is with us also. He's currently serving as Associate Medical Director at GW Pharma and is the medical lead for the UK and Ireland markets. Dr. Vyas is a pharmacist by background with a decade of experience in the pharma industry in global and affiliate roles within both medical affairs and market access. So knowing how to straddle those worlds, I think is key. Kishan has spearheaded numerous organizational real-world evidence initiatives, both in the clinical and health economic realms across a variety of therapeutic areas. And Dr. Vyas is going to talk to us about some of the key challenges that manufacturers face in generating relevant real-world data, and very importantly, and I'm looking forward to this, how to deal with the multitude of stakeholders on both the internal and external side. So, Kish, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Roman, and thank you for Certara for inviting me today to speak to you all. And I think it's a really valid topic at the moment that we're discussing, considering some of the challenges that we're facing in the industry in general at the moment. And as Roman said, you know, I'm here to speak as somebody from the pharmaceutical industry to talk to you about some of the challenges that we face at the moment as well, and in communication and generating a real world evidence plan. So these are my disclaimers. So move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So talking about real world evidence from a company point of view, you know, we define evidence generation, or real world evidence in this case, which is a buzz term at the moment in the industry, as data regarding the usage or the potential benefits or risks of a drug derived from sources other than traditional clinical trials. I mean, by the letter of the definition, and also when you think about various codes that exist within Europe especially, real world evidence for us means understanding the usage and the potential benefits or risks of the drug itself. So there are many different types of real world evidence that go beyond just the medicine, maybe talking about disease area, etc. But just for the sake of today's conversation, we'll be talking about real world evidence in the context of the actual medicine itself. So why is it important for real world evidence to be generated? And as an organization, there are many different areas where it provides value. Clearly, firstly, regulators use evidence, real world evidence, to inform decisions. They use it to track safety and efficacy post-approval. So these are your post-authorization type studies. Reimbursement bodies such as NICE in the UK, or we've heard about AMNOG in Germany, or the GBA in Germany, they use that to make decisions on the cost effectiveness or the budget impact of new medicines or new indications that are coming onto the market. And they also use real world evidence to, as Oliver said in his previous talk, to monitor ongoing value of a medicine in the market as well. So even if you have access, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to maintain access in 5 years' time. Reimbursement bodies like to reopen up files potentially, and having real world evidence to actually support your value within that time period is crucial to make sure that you maintain access and pricing in the market. Physicians and prescribers clearly use real world evidence to inform clinical management. When new medicines are launched, in general, we find that many clinicians and many payers are not that familiar with the medicine, and for them to become familiar, it's not just about clinicians being able to talk to each other or other healthcare professionals and payers talking to each other. We also need to provide real world management experience to give them that will also help inform them. In the world these days, patients actually also play a much bigger role in the treatment choices, in the decision-making process when they go into discussions with their healthcare professional. So you'll find that actually patients will also potentially use real-world evidence to help inform their own treatment choices. And with the current world we live in, with the internet, etc., everybody probably knows that Google or Dr. Google is one of the most commonly used physicians that patients use to actually inform themselves. So real-world evidence is the opportunity to provide robust information that if patients go and search for this type of information, they can actually gain valuable data rather than the immense amount of data that exists across Google to actually help them inform treatment choices.
I guess, Kish, if I could interrupt, I mean, no more highlighted than what we just saw over the last 18 months in the COVID story with all of the data that's out there. I mean, there were definitely strong opinions among the patient communities, right? I mean, what do we learn from this in our more routine communications around treatments and real world evidence?
Absolutely, no, exactly. And the coronavirus vaccines, etc., has been a perfect example of that. And when we talk about communication a bit later on, you'll understand why it's very important for us to be engaging with patients or with patient groups at the outset of a clinical program, when you're setting up a clinical program or a real-world evidence program, so that you understand the voice of the patient early on to help shape your evidence strategy. That's vital. And obviously, last but not least, companies use real-world evidence to gain regulatory and reimbursement approval. I think we're all very familiar with that, you know, and that leads to optimization of patient uptake and access over the life cycle, as I mentioned earlier. So when it comes to forming a real-world evidence strategy from a company point of view, this is very top line. There's obviously a lot of detail that goes into this, but really the evidence that is needed to support market access and uptake at launch is vital. And how and at what point you actually gain that support is also really important when we start talking about communication and evidence generation in general. And of course, understanding what evidence is required to maintain prices and access, as I spoke about earlier. So to do that, what we also need to do as a company is understand what data sources are available. And one of the critical things, and I'm going to go talk about that in a bit on my next slide, is understanding what sources are available internationally and what sources are available at an affiliate level. And there are market potential differences there. So understanding those data sources is important, because then that will help us understand where we can potentially mine existing data, but also it will give us an understanding where we actually need to do either some prospective or retrospective data collection where that data doesn't exist. And last but not least, you know, especially for those who work with agency, etc., capacity of the team at the organization that you're either supporting is vital, because when you tailor a specific solution, that solution needs to also be something that the company itself can deliver from their point of view too. So if we move on to the next slide, please, I'm going to talk a bit more around some of the differences and challenges that you face between a global and an affiliate. So I've worked in both. I've been in at a global level. I've worked in at affiliate level. At the moment, I'm at an affiliate level. So in general, my experience has been that evidence generation and real-world evidence strategies have generally been led, especially in smaller companies, at a global level rather than at an affiliate level. And in general, that strategy has mainly been informed by the US, and maybe quite rightly by the US, considering it's probably the biggest market in the world for many organizations. But where does that leave affiliates? The challenges that we face at an affiliate level is that, as you all know, healthcare systems in different countries are different. Even if you take countries within Europe, what happens in the UK at a healthcare level versus what happens in Germany, the healthcare systems are different, and therefore the evidence generation that we need to generate will also be different in terms of strategy. So when a evidence generation strategy is driven at a global level, it sometimes doesn't take into consideration some of the individual healthcare system challenges that exist at affiliate levels. Global teams also have wider resources. They can generally do bigger studies. At affiliate level, with smaller budgets, we need to be a bit more innovative in the way we generate that evidence. And at an affiliate level, what you find is that global driven strategies sometimes don't actually give the value that we need in the healthcare environment. So building on that, being at an affiliate level, we as an affiliate also have to think about our evidence generation, and we do our own mapping and understand different evidence gaps. And we have different stakeholders that exist compared to maybe some of the other countries. So if we move on to the next slide, first thing you'll see about this slide is, wow, this is a very, very busy slide. And I've purposely made it very busy because what I want to highlight, this is just an example of a UK stakeholder plan, a very top line stakeholder plan for that matter, because we just go into the individual bodies here. And the first thing you'll see is the complexity that exists at an affiliate level. This is just a UK stakeholder plan. So can you imagine what a stakeholder plan across other countries or even at an international level will look like? So when we talk about a real world evidence plan and when we talk about communication, we need to make sure that that plan entails all of the potential large stakeholder groups that you see on this slide. So if we take an example here, what you'll see is the healthcare professionals in the middle of the slide alongside the patient, which is obviously really important. But alongside that, what you'll see within the UK, as an example, is national organisations, local commissioning groups, regional groups, government groups, so Westminster and Whitehall in this case, the media and comms, which is clearly very important, as you'll see what's happening with coronavirus right now. The media has a lot of influence at the moment in patient decision making, it seems. We have the patient groups themselves, we have professional organizations, and we have the regulators and the safeguarding groups as well. So what you can see here from this slide is the sheer complexity that we have when we want to develop an evidence generation strategy and a communication strategy. So when we talk about what to do, whether it's at a payer level or whether it's at a clinical level, I think it's very important that organizations and companies that support organizations support these companies at a very early stage. Because what you'll find is that if you haven't considered these groups when you develop the clinical program, and you haven't considered the evidence generation you're going to need to do to support the communication strategy for these stakeholder groups, then what you'll find is either you're behind the curve or you'll find that you may not actually end up being able to launch as a result of the challenges that you face for not planning that earlier in the life cycle of the medicine. So I hope that's quite clear. So if I was to give you a take-home message, really, is when you think about the evidence generation strategy, you need to think really early with the stakeholder groups. You need to consider the individual needs of an affiliate, considering that different healthcare systems exist in different countries. And last but not least, when we think about access, those access discussions, and it has started to happen more recently, but those access discussions need to start a lot earlier than when you're expecting to get a license or post approval. And I know that Sumit is going to be talking a bit more in detail around some of these nuanced challenges as well. So I'll pause there, Roman, and I'll open for some questions before we move on.
Well, listen, I thought we had a monopoly on drawing complex, stakeholder maps in the U.S., but, I think for our U.S. colleagues, we're not the only ones that have these sort of multifaceted groups. And I think sometimes we have this mindset like, well, the European countries, UK, not Europe anymore, but the European countries have, just one payer to deal with. And clearly, it's not the only stakeholder. Obviously, there's clinicians and all of this stuff, but thanks for bringing that up. What I see is you have a multidimensional internal and external communication challenge and alignment on research questions and all of this. I mean, how you have also limited budgets. You can't do a study for each stakeholder or for each country even. Like, how are you navigating that and trying to kill 5 birds with 2 stones? Like, what's your mentality? Are you using technology? Are you using common protocols? Like, what's your basic approach?
Yeah. So when considering the different healthcare environments, what we essentially recognize in general is that clearly there is a need for us to make sure that we are generating evidence to continue the life cycle of medicine. So what we are doing, for example, is across Europe, because of the different healthcare systems, as you've just mentioned, a common protocol will actually define what the needs are in terms of commonality across the different countries. So what we are kind of thinking about and developing is having a common protocol that is something that is supported by all the affiliates. Let's take Europe as the example across Europe. And then each individual affiliate is planning to take that protocol and almost localizing it to then also support the local healthcare environment within country as well. And that will include then trying to bring together some of the stakeholder groups that are important in the UK, but may not be common in Germany, for example. And we'll look at some of the outcomes that are important for the UK, but may not be as important for some of the other countries. So that's the kind of approach that we are thinking about, but also how do we then target all these different stakeholder groups? And as you say, it may be not 5 birds into 2, it may be 5 into 3, or it may be 6 into 4, for example. But what we don't do is do individual studies for these common groups, for example. And there may be different approaches. When people think about real-world evidence in general, people think that observational data is what they want, which is not necessarily true. If we can add value in other ways, and if we can do different types of studies and use different types of technologies that can support us, and something that we engage with the payer groups with to say that, is this something that is going to be validated, then that is something that I think we should be exploring. It's not just about doing your standard phase 4 studies. I think we need to think beyond that.
Yeah. So one last question before I move on to Sumit. We at Certara have some self-interest, and both Leif and I brought this up in our opening remarks about, let's say, having the right technology to support this complex set of insights, because that's what you just talked about is like, organizing your messaging and your designs and your information. But if, again, as I said before, if you don't have that right platform, whether it be digital or some other means within the organization to communicate, it falls apart. So what are you doing in your organization? How do you feel about that need for those sort of platforms, at least on the communication end? But I'm also seeing it more and more on the analytic end, like to have live insights so you can sort of walk through things and see, oh, if we looked at this subset, what does it tell us? Are you incorporating this kind of thing in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, we are. And coming back to what you previously said about internally, how are we thinking about communicating data? I think that question is something that needs to be answered actually when you're doing and planning the evidence generation. So if you take, for example, you're planning to do a study, you know, that study, you need to think about the knock-on effect on how you're going to communicate that well early in advance, so that when the time comes, you're not actually thinking about, oh, what are we doing? What platforms are we going to use to actually get the communication from this data out there now? That thought process should have already happened, essentially. Yeah. So when considering digital platforms, for example, if we have a piece of evidence generation that we've completed, we would have already said to ourselves, right, this is a piece of evidence that's going to be vital for our sales team, for example, to be going out there to communicate. And then at that point, when we've decided that actually this is something the sales teams are going to be using, we already have built-in channels, such as the digital channels, or whether that's the sales reps going out themselves to go in to talk to clinicians, or whether that's via our conference strategy, etc. We have that communication strategy already in place. So it's us basically switching the button to say that now that we've got this data, we've already planned to use it as for the sales team. We are going to use these channels to ultimately communicate that data. But if you don't have that planning done early enough, what actually essentially happens is that you start making decisions too late. And you may find that if you haven't planned it appropriately, then certain messaging won't be able to be done because they may be off license, or there may be other challenges to the actual data that makes it very difficult to communicate. So all of that planning kind of needs to happen at once. And traditionally, companies, I think, Oliver, you talked about this, we've had a very old-fashioned mindset in that we do a clinical program, we then do the phase 4 studies, and then we do the communication. Whereas actually all that thinking needs to happen on the outset, so that we have all those strategies and stuff in place, so we know exactly what the streamlined process from the start to the finish is going to be. Yeah. Completely agree. Thank you, Kish. So now on to our anchorman, Sumit. No pressure. We saved the best for last, right? So Dr. Bakshi is Vice President of Real World Data Solutions at Certara Evidence and Access. Sumit is a medical doctor with a rich and well-rounded history within the pharmaceutical industry, spanning roles over 22 years, from brand management to medical communications and strategic planning, and has worked for household names such as Pfizer and J&J. But the past decade, we've been fortunate enough to have Sumit at the helm of our real-world evidence projects here at Certara Evidence and Access. Sumit joined us in 2011 when we were still under the banner Analytica Laser. Sumit's going to build on what we've been discussing and give us some of his views on how RWE communications are fundamentally different than the communications around other types of clinical data, and how RWE can really contribute to a shift in engagement with stakeholders and advanced access. So, Sumit, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Roman. I'm sorry, I'm presenting this slide. Most of the audience would have seen a comparison between RCTs and real-world evidence in many forums. So my apologies for presenting it again, but I just wanted to kind of, make a kind of set a level between RCTs and real-world evidence, and how that difference impacts communication of the two types of evidence. So just going very quickly through the purpose of an RCT. It is to establish efficacy and safety, whereas RWE could be used for many purposes to establish effectiveness, be it clinical effectiveness, economic effectiveness, effectiveness on humanistic outcomes, or even safety and so on. So real world evidence is a lot more versatile than RCTs. Of course, real world evidence presents real life practice situations as against experimental situations with an RCT. There is a lot of variability within real world evidence, whereas in a randomized control trial, the homogeneity is more or less forced into the experiment, and the homogeneity is not just forced in terms of design, but in terms of population selection, in terms of treatment, in terms of how patients are followed up, measurements are made, definitions are derived, and so on. Whereas in the real world, we see a lot more variation in how treatments are administered, in how patients take those treatments, in how even how disease is defined. For example, coding might differ from system to system. One physician might code a certain patient in a certain way, whereas if you send the same patient to another physician, that physician might have a different coding for that patient. So there is a lot of variability. The monitoring required on an RCT is very intense, whereas on real world evidence, there is absolutely no monitoring. It's free flowing data coming in from the real world. Data quality and external validity, they will go hand in hand. Because the data quality is high, the acceptance of RCT is very high, but they are not generalizable. Whereas, with real world evidence, the data quality can be really variable, but the acceptance and validity can be pretty high. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So now let's look at how communication differs between the traditional media that were used for randomized clinical trials, and how real world evidence opens up the use of possible new media. So, for example, earlier RCTs were communicated using scientific publications, using slide presentations, using evidence dossiers, or incorporation into budget impact or cost effectiveness models. The messaging was mainly centralized. It was, as Kishan described, it was mainly driven by the global teams, and more or less implemented by the affiliate in their own way. But the core messaging was very, very very centralized. Whereas real world evidence, with the diverse and complex stakeholder map that we saw on Kishan's slide, it opens up an area as to you need to be communicating relevant messages to a relevant audience, and with that need, real world evidence offers the opportunity to offer local evidence of pertinent evidence of smaller populations to population substrata to your stakeholders. And this can be done using interactive tools, dashboards, visualization software, or the digital communication media that Kishan also alluded to. Essentially, the concept of real world evidence, it enables distributed messaging, and it communicating real world evidence will have to take into account the versatility of the data itself, in terms of the basic characteristics of the data, the 4 V's of big data. I won't belabor them. Moving on to my last slide, I know I'm running out of time. So I've just tried to map the traditional media that were used for communication of RCTs and the newer real world oriented media, to the WHO communicating for health framework. And we see that the traditional media of RCTs, they are pretty complex for a large stakeholder, for a diverse stakeholder group to understand. They can be understood very well by the scientific community, but not by lay people. Whereas real world evidence is out there. People understand it, although not technically, but they have access to it. RCTs can be actionable. They're more credible. real-world evidence can be positioned in many ways. Communication is always two ways. It's always what you want to communicate as well as how people want to interpret it. So, the interpretation part of real-world evidence, because of the way it gets distributed, it has to be controlled in a way in case the messaging has to be consistent. It has to be controlled in a way that it remains credible. The RCTs are relevant, but they are relevant only to the population that was studied in the trial, whereas real world evidence can be relevant to individual stakeholders, can be more relevant. The biggest factor for biggest difference between real world evidence and RCT is the timeliness. So clinical trials will take their own time. Yes, the industry has shown a different pathway for the COVID vaccine trials in terms of crunching timelines, but real world evidence, can be made available much more timely, in a more timely manner to audiences, especially when it comes to live dashboards and so on. So I'll stop there. Roman, for questions.
Yeah. So Sumeet, talk to me about. I mean, you talk about this concept of sort of centralized, harmonized, and maybe homogeneous messages coming out of a clinical program, and in the real world context, we have these sort of distributed messages and multiple audiences. Again, I'll sort of ask you the same question I asked Kish, which is, what are the roles of our technology and our communication platforms in helping us to solve that riddle? Just the multifaceted aspects of what we're trying to do, and that timeliness. Does that give you a particular advantage, or are there pitfalls? Like, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I would say that centralized messaging is here to stay. It will remain the primary method of scientific communication, and even real world evidence studies will be communicated via centralized messaging. That's essential. It's the distributed messaging that needs a little bit more attention and planning. When there are different stakeholder groups, and these stakeholder groups want different types of information, and they can take away very, very diverse messages from if the interpretation is left to them. So examples of this could be, we saw this during the COVID situation. Say, for example, the hydroxychloroquine issue, wherein there was real world evidence that was presented, and it got interpreted in many different ways. Even many agencies interpreted it in a way that some agencies granted emergency authorization, some agencies held on for a long time. So it was, even for the scientific community, it was very difficult to kind of interpret some of those messages. So when it comes to distributed messaging, and digital tools, I would say digital tools can allow for more or less planning for a homogenized, not a homogenized, but at least having a common thread in your communication to diverse stakeholders. So
maybe setting some guardrails and this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm being pushed to wrap up, so I'll give everybody their 15-second closing remark, starting from left to right. Oliver, you're there. If there was one piece of advice you would give to our customers and to others in industry about communicating the value of their products using real-world evidence, what would that be?
Do it as early as possible.
Engage, I think I heard that from you before. And Kish, what would you say was that single piece? If you don't want to steal Oliver's, you have to come up with another one.
I'm not going to steal Oliver's, but I'll build on Oliver's and say, think about your plans of communication when you think about planning your evidence early as well.
All right, and last but not least, Sumit.
Yeah, I would say think about the communication and the relevant media that you're going to use, and how the communication is going to be interpreted, with the different media that you've planned to use.
All right, great. Well, listen, thank you, everybody. I will pass it back to Tom for the close. Really appreciate your guys' contributions here and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you very much, Roman. Special thank you to all of our panelists today, Oliver, Kishan, Sumit, Max, Alex, and Andre, and obviously our two moderators as well, Roman and Sean. And a special thanks to the audience as well for attending. We appreciate you taking the time to join us here today. We hope you found the session both useful and informative. Just a reminder to please fill out the exit survey when you leave, and we wish you a pleasant rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at one of our events soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.